Sorry to be
Hello,
a couple
hello,
minutes
good
late.
morning. Today our guest is Professor David Audretsch. Did I get it right?
You got it perfect.
All right, but I'm just going to say David. So how are you doing, David?
Well, I'm happy to see you. Happy to see you, Lipton. How are you doing?
I'm great. Well, I got the email from you and he said it's a pleasure. So you seem to be very excited to do this interview.
I am excited to meet you, Lipton.
May I ask why?
Why? Well, because you've got a very positive energy and spirit. I like
Yeah,
that, and it's a great topic.
yeah, but I'm asking why because e- I'm even baffled. I submit interviews to distinguished academics like yourself, and all of you keep saying yes. And I'm relatively unknown. So
Well, no, I'll tell you the truth, because we're in the business. Our business model is we want to get our ideas out there and make them public and well known. And an insight I learned from a colleague, Paula Stefan at Georgia State University 3 decades ago, is that people in business, in the private sector rather, they want to keep their ideas and insights private for their companies. So we actually are always happy to talk to, I don't say people like you, but yeah, because we're in the business of getting our ideas out there. And that's what actually drives our own individual business model.
all right, great. So you have written several excellent papers, but we will focus keenly on two of your more recent papers. One is titled Institutions and Entrepreneurship Quality, and the other is titled The Future of Entrepreneurship, the Few or the Many. Now, David, for your first paper, you put forward a number of theories and they were tested in the article, so we will be delving into them one by one. And the first
Okay, it sounds good.
yeah, the first theory I would like you to examine is the relationship between regulatory quality and entrepreneurship quality. What's the link?
Yes, yes. You know, first of all, let me start by saying it's not new in the literature or what research has looked at, the link between regulation and entrepreneurship. But the tendency has been to treat both of them as homogeneous, as if there's only one kind of regulation, it's more or less, and there's one kind of entrepreneurship, it's more or less. But in fact, just like flavors of ice cream or brands of cola or lots of things in our world, there's not just one type of regulation or one type of entrepreneurship. It's heterogeneous, diverse, and has multiple manifestations. So what we're doing is recognizing, and that's the way the world of ideas works, research works. The first step is to recognize, oh, regulation matters on entrepreneurship. And then the next step is to make it a little bit more realistic and realize there's lots and lots of different types of regulation, or maybe the analogy is with pizza, right? I mean, there's lots and lots of types of pizza, there's lots and lots of types of regulation. And so in this paper, we actually recognize and measure the different types of regulation. And then we're able to distinguish between so-called quality entrepreneurship, which is entrepreneurship that's more focused on innovation and growth rather than just survival, which we would call not important innovation, but it would be kind of a lesser quality. And that's what the paper is about. So the hypothesis is the higher the quality of regulation, the higher the quality of entrepreneurship.
David, so your paper is very broad and dealt with a number of issues, but as someone who's interested in high quality entrepreneurship, what are your thoughts on laws like the Bayh-Dole Act and various technology transfer legislation that the Americans have implemented to boost entrepreneurship? I'm just being specific because when I think about high quality entrepreneurship, I'm referring to science and technology laws.
Exactly. But you know what, Lipton? You got either the spirit of the paper or, we don't mention, I don't believe in the paper. Sounds like you've read it more recently than me. We don't mention those key words you just said, Bayh-Dole and then
The technology transfer.
technology transfer. I was going to say the small business innovation, which is part of technology transfer, right? And those are exactly that kind of entrepreneurship, which is from universities or based on new technologies generated maybe in a university or a research lab. That's what we mean by high quality entrepreneurship. And your observation, I like the way you put this, much more understandable than we do in the paper. That actually comes from regulation. I mean, in the end, the Bayh-Dole Act is a kind of a regulation, and the technology transfer rules, which in a way are linked up to the Bayh-Dole Act, but there's some others too. That's also a kind of a regulation. And most people don't think of it as regulation. It's certainly a government. That's the point of the paper. You got this. It's conducive to, what you characterize as, we characterize as high quality entrepreneurship. And that's the complexity. I think the mistake in the past, I mean, it's not a mistake. Research is a journey. So, when I think about the way I was when I was 17 years old or 15 years old, I think, oh my God, the crazy things I did. Was that a mistake? Well, I was on my journey. Research is also on a journey. I'm very evolutionary kind of oriented, and I guess I see things as evolving in a journey. So a lot of the thinking has been, a lot of the debates have been, certainly when we get to real policy and the real world policy debates, is regulation good or is it bad in general? I mean, we see in the red state, blue state divide, it just, is it good or bad? And the answer is, it depends. Is it good or bad for entrepreneurship? The answer is, it depends. Exactly. And the two examples you give are actually my two favorite examples, along with the Small Business Innovation Research Program, the SBR program, that fits right in there. But people not to think around the world, also at home here, they tend not to think of this as government regulation. They tend to think of it, oh, that's successful business. But yeah, it comes from government regulation for sure.
Yeah, so in a recent article, David, I made a distinction between political institutions and economic institutions. So political institutions provide the confidence for businesses to operate, but economic institutions are responsible to enhance the productivity of the business. So for example, technology-based laws, or when Ireland created an intellectual property strategy to boost innovation in government. These represent economic institutions because they have a direct impact on the productivity of businesses.
That's a very, that's what I'll say academics do, but in some ways, I mean, that's what thought leaders do. Exactly what you're doing, Lipton, in that insight. We kind of look at the world and then we think, oh, we can break it down. That used to be kind of popular in popular culture, say, we're going to break it down. Well, you just broke it down into two different buckets. I never quite thought of it that way. Political institutions, economic institutions, or I should say, Lipton, no, I've always thought of it that way. I never quite put a label to it. It sounds so simple, what you just did, political institutions, economic institutions. And once I hear that come out of your mouth, I think, oh yeah, that's what was in my mind. That's what we do in the world of ideas. Now, it's also true, again, it's evolutionary. I mean, in a way you explain, boom, very simply, these are two different types of institutions. You'd also probably be the first person to say, although you put them in two different buckets, they're interrelated. They're related somehow. They're not totally independent of each other. One affects the other for sure, right?
Yes, and another pertinent issue is the role of venture capital, and we're going to discuss venture capital. But researchers often argue that the surplus of venture capital can explain entrepreneurial growth. But I beg to differ. Trust is a predictor of economic growth, and in some countries, even if there is a paucity of venture capital, if people trust each other, then entrepreneurs are more likely to access funding from venture capitals, and they're also more likely to start venture capital networks. Low trust societies are less likely to invest in venture capital.
Once again, I think your instinct, intuition, insight is exactly, what do the Brits say? Spot on. I mean, I think that's exactly right. In some ways, you're kind of probing the causality. And the problem is really, this is a deeper issue in social sciences, policy, business. What are the deeper fundamental relationships that drive it? And what are the more surface, just kind of, we'd say, spurious correlation? I mean, is it really the venture capital? That's what we hear from a lot of practitioners, policy people, academics. And then when you say, oh no, that's actually superficial, what drives it more deeply is the trust. And, in some ways, Lipton, you discover, I want to say, oh, what we knew a generation ago, maybe 2 generations ago, when the focus wasn't so much on knowledge capital or entrepreneurship capital, but it was on the old-fashioned physical capital. And what people started to realize was, you could see, like in the developed countries, investing in infrastructure, like building, highways or dams or something like that, was positively related to economic growth. So then they went out to developing country contexts and would build these infrastructure projects that actually didn't have the conditions for the local population to take advantage of. So what worked in one context doesn't work in another context. That's kind of what you're saying. If the trust is there, the venture capital will be effective. In fact, saying, Lipton, the venture capital is drawn to places where there's trust in the social capital. So you could argue the social capital is kind of a precondition. But if you throw in venture capital into a context where there's no trust, you could say very obviously, try to put venture capital into Afghanistan today, tomorrow, see how good that works. Not going to work at all, right? And that's, but so this thinking, I think when we hear these statements that say, oh, venture capital spurs entrepreneurship, it does if a bunch of other conditions are met, like the existence of trust. If they're not met, it doesn't work. But you're kind of uncovering, this is in a way what makes research fascinating, is how to kind of get to what's really the deep cause of something rather than what looks like there's a correlation, but it's not really the deeper cause. And the trouble is, and you know this, I can tell, Lipton, with your insights, it's a chicken and egg kind of hunt, which comes first, right? Which comes first, the venture capital or the trust? I mean, or it will say, sometimes venture capital, people use that not really as what it is, but as a early stage finance. But one thing we know, without the trust, it's going to be hard to have any kind of finance work. We see, say, in my example of Afghanistan, I just read, finance is obviously fleeing, the country right now. So yeah, the trust is important. But on the other hand, trust emerges from experience, a lot of positive outcomes. That's what makes research fascinating, a fascinating journey.
But David, we are yet to really unpack the mystery of trust. We may know how trust is maintained, but how do we explain the evolution of trust? This is still a question in economics. Free markets can promote trust, but why would people engage in markets in the first place? To engage in market activity, one would need trust. So, for example, a popular paper was published some years ago by the National Bureau of Economic Research, confirming the assumptions of Robert Putnam that some places in Italy have higher rates of trust and social capital. And the writers linked trust and social capital to city-states and market economies. But why would people embed themselves in market economies if they did not trust each other?
Right. So you get to this idea of causality. And, Lipton, I'm a competitive guy, so I want to outdo you. At least I can say I'm older than you. So I remember my freshman year in college. When was that? 1872? No, it was 1972. Sorry, wrong century, 1972. And one of the first things we had to read was this work by kind of an anthropologist or I don't know, anthropological economist named Carl Polanyi.
Yes.
Like, oh yeah, I want to say even you've heard of him. When I say the even, I mean at your ripe age. I don't know too many people.
Yeah, we still know Carl and Michael.
There you go, Carl Michael. Right. And then you remember part of what his insight was that trust was gained from, I guess Putnam would say social capital. It was a social cultural phenomena, and the trust comes first. And that was the important insight, because certainly at that point, back in 1972, what I was learning in economics, the T word was, it didn't exist. I mean, you just didn't see it. Now, slowly it incorporates. So really, I'll say, Lipton, to a young person like you, I'll say, you know, once again, I'm going to say, thinking ideas are evolutionary. They're constantly moving. What you're absorbing is, wait a minute, this doesn't really make sense. That's what creates the research opportunity for you, for a new generation of researchers, academics, thought leaders, to change thinking, the way we think, by doing the hard, heavy lifting of the research, convince us how and why trust matters. Take Putnam, take Polanyi, take everybody, and then try to inject it into economics, because you're right, we're only at the very beginning of understanding. In fact, it's clear. You said we don't really understand trust. You know, one thing I learned: one person does not solve everything. Somebody said famously, I don't think we dare mention this person anymore, it takes a village to raise a child, no doubt, but it takes a giant community to start to understand any phenomena like the role of trust. And I would say, Lipton, I think we tend to be arrogant. Now I'm going to put you, not as you, but as we. You think you're on the good side. No, you're on the bad side. We as economists, we tend to kind of think, oh, if we don't invent it, if it doesn't come from us, the idea is not really vetted, thought about. So there's a lot to be gained by looking to other social scientists, other thinkers. Having said that, you know, where trust comes from, it's a crucial issue. It's a big issue, and it's going to take an army of really scholars to really go after this thing.
Yes, and Joe Enrich has started some of the heavy lifting. I think Word is a great book.
Yes, I think, well, a buddy of mine once said to me, I think he said it like 30 years ago. He said, you know, David, he goes, research, typically articles or books, either end debates or start debates. He could have said, or something in the middle. You know, that work is surely not starting the debate, but it's going to take a whole body of research. Just like, you know, kind of understanding COVID, we clearly don't understand it right now. We think we understand it, you know, as a scientific community, or as you and me, consumers of it. We think they think they understand it, but it keeps shifting around, it keeps moving, they keep getting new findings. Of course, the phenomena shifts around too, right? It's going to take a long time. The good news is we understand, I don't know what infectious disease, measles, we understand all kinds of infectious diseases, but it surely didn't happen from one study.
The moment we're able to understand the propensity of COVID to rapidly mutate, then we can develop a cure.
Oh, now I've got something to argue with you about, and I'm going to argue with the word moment. I love that. That's an economist thinking in a way, which says, well, in equilibrium, this happens. You almost take time out of it. But of course, you and I know, and I know you're going to agree with me, it's going to take a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. In fact, with a moment we understood what COVID was, it took research and development, scientists and labs, clinical testing, a supply chain, pitting, you know, all the stuff, you know, you had to get the vaccination. So a moment in economics time, that's the power of economics. It kind of gives us a sense of long-term equilibrium. You're right. In real time, of course, but over the course of a lifetime, decades, a century. I mean, honestly, when people look back at this, just like when you and I, was more you than me, when you look back, say at World War I, it seems like a moment, maybe a long moment. But of course, if you put yourself back into 1918, that was not a moment, right? A lot of blood, sweat, and tears. So it's funny. Maybe that's the difference as we learn in economics. Long run, short run. I think it was Albert Einstein once said, well, kiss your best, I don't know, person, and a moment seems like it's gone in a flash. Put your hand on a burner, and a moment seems like it lasted an eternity. So, no, and that's important in a way, because the analysis from the time perspective is actually different. That's probably why, to go back, Lipton, why some people, I mean, academics, scholars will say, oh, yeah, venture capital will drive entrepreneurship. Because in the very long run, I suppose, trust will be built up, there'll be venture capital, and you'll see what looks like a correlation. Certainly, it'll seem like causality, but that's in the long run. That's kind of skipping by, going back to your first insight. Yeah, but you need the trust. I mean, living in the heartland here in Indiana, don't think there's a lot of trust here in terms of the kind of trust it takes for venture capital. Surely there's more of that trust in the Bay Area, of Madison, Wisconsin, Austin, Texas, Research Triangle, the East Coast. It takes a long time for that to build up. But you're also right. So the time, what do we call it in economics? The temporal perspective or something.
And David, I'm happy that you referred to infrastructure. Infrastructural projects may be unsuccessful in developing countries because they are less productive. So for example, Jamaica has relatively good infrastructure, and politicians like to brag that they're building highways, but there's no correlation between highways and economic growth. From 1972 to 2007, the productivity rate declined, and because of COVID, it has plummeted even further. To benefit from infrastructure, country must have the right institutions that are able to elevate the quality of production. You cannot build, you cannot
Right.
exactly, you cannot build quality infrastructure if you do not have anything to produce.
When I worked in Germany way back in the before the turn of the century, one of my colleagues, I liked him out, Gernot Graber, he's now a professor there someplace, wrote a book, and something called Cathedrals and Deserts, building cathedrals and deserts. And he was really making he says, you can build whatever you want to in the middle of, say, the Sahara Desert, Death Valley, and you don't have what you just said, the complementary institutions, mindset, skills, competencies, whatever, to make it work. And, we see not just in developing countries. I mean, I think we see this in developed countries. I experienced this again in Germany after the Berlin Wall fell. And one of the strategies of the German government was to pour money into the infrastructure in, they call it the new states of Germany, or the old East Germany. And, the infrastructure, this was kind of a political problem. They had the best infrastructure in the country, the newest roads, the newest everything, train stations. Meanwhile, it was starting to kind of run down in West Germany, but it didn't impact productivity like they assumed, because they didn't have, I'm just repeating what you said, I experienced the ancillary institutions, which is a big word. I mean, is it culture? Is it specific policies? That's kind of the missing blocks. Although, to go back to my first example about cathedrals in the desert, you ever been to Las Vegas?
No, I've only been to the US like 5 or 6 times, or maybe less.
Well, I've only been to Las Vegas like once, so I'm only one trip ahead of you. But, you go to Las Vegas, and of course, it's a thriving place, kind of hit hard by COVID because of tourism. But the point is, it was policies, it was also business leaders that said, here's a desert, let's build a cathedral. We'll call it a casino. Now we have to get the infrastructure. We need the water from wherever and so on. And so, or Dubai, right? Dubai is this place also in the desert. They built a cathedral and it worked. So even there, it is this mystery. Now, one thing for sure, it doesn't happen in a day. This goes back to the time, they started this decades ago in both places, and now we see flourishing. So one thing about, nobody would say, oh, building cathedrals. People don't think of Dubai or Las Vegas. I could think of other places too where I've seen this, which aren't even deserts, right? Like, Bilbao, Spain, probably not a place on people's minds, but that was just a down and out, decayed industrial manufacturing, shipbuilding city, kind of like Detroit, except it was shipbuilding, not autos. And they built cathedrals there. Well, it was actually a Guggenheim museum, the first one out of the North America. They got to locate in Bilbao, Spain, of all weird places. And then the tourists started to come. The designers started to come, the creative people. They discovered the Rioja wine that's popular around the world. So it's complicated. So to say what is ancillary? Now, I would say, well, they had the right culture. They had the right leaders. Something was there that wasn't there, say, in Montreal decades ago. I remember they built a new airport and it just seemed to be unused, dormant for a long time. And people called that a failure, where they didn't seem to have the ancillary institutions. So it's hard to say what the formula is, or what do you young people say, the algorithm, so that we can be sure that this investment is going to get a return. But that's also true if you're investing in the stock market, right? How can you be sure? That's what we call uncertainty.
Yeah, so and because we're talking about entrepreneurship, I must refer to crime. How do we solve crime or reduce drug crimes? Well, maybe if we were to legalize drug crimes and then watch the consequence, then we'd be in a better position to craft the relevant institutions. So for example, if you're in the business of just selling drugs, you're selling drugs, can you engage a bank? No, you cannot engage a bank. Therefore, there's an incentive for you to engage in further criminal activities to enrich yourself. But if we were to legalize drugs, whether it be cocaine, marijuana, we legalize drugs, and then druggists create professional organizations to train each other and to punish those who engage in fraud, maybe crime would be reduced because the druggists would have an incentive to invest in a legitimate financial organization.
I like the way you think. I mean, the logic, in a way, I can see you've got this is the power of economics. Are you a student of economics?
I really cannot, but I actually studied history and international relations in Jamaica.
You're a Renaissance man, not
Yeah.
from LA, but a Renaissance man from the New World over here.
Yeah.
Renaissance man. Well, that's even better, because I think in a way that broad thinking, when you bring that to bear to issues, that equips you to be able to, just like you've been doing on what we've been talking about, like the corruption, you're able to shed light because you've got kind of a different perspective. And it's slightly a different topic, but it's important. But I can see you've got kind of models in your mind of this affects this affects this. It's certainly a great topic. Lots of us, and certainly in my paper, we say, it seems kind of, what do we call it, a platitude. It says, oh yes, less crime will probably is conducive to more, at least, legal entrepreneurship. Start talking about illegal entrepreneurship, it gets more complicated, right, from what you just said. But the paper, and how do you reduce crime? Do you actually legalize or have stronger enforcement to things like you said, drugs? And then, that develops a whole field of research that we hope they supply answers to us about the specific, at least people like me who study entrepreneurship. That's a specific type of, I guess you could say, policy or regulation. And that's complex in its own way, because we can see examples, certainly the prohibition in the United States, when they legalized alcohol, it seemed to reduce all the bootleggers and a lot of the crime and Al Capone and the rest of it. On the other hand, I don't know what the, we can see other places where it doesn't seem to work as well. And so once again, we're to what you said, the context. This is probably the bottom line. The context matters. In somehow as researchers, we're always looking for broad generalizations. And yet the context matters. So what works in one context doesn't work in another context. And that's probably partly what makes research so interesting. So I just kind of, but I'll tell you, it's a very important issue, no doubt about it.
Yeah, we should also jettison the concept of dark money. If you're accumulating wealth by not defrauding other people, then your money is legitimate. So for example, porn stars, businesses should not have a problem engaging porn stars or druggists. If you're not killing people or directly defrauding people, then your money is not dark. And the advantage of dark money is that it can create an oasis of funding to finance underserved communities, because many of these people are from the lower socioeconomic status. So maybe then they could become the venture capitalists in their communities.
Hernando de
De
Soto.
Soto.
Oh, yes, you know him too. You were really well read. I was going to say a young fellow like you can't possibly have heard of him. My claim to fame is I met him for the first time about right before the pandemic, and it was a delight to meet him. But so his work, and his point was, it's the financial, the funding, the financing is largely coming from dark money or informal sector and so on, because the formal sector, which gets to the regulations again, that's kind of your point, is blocking it. Now, in some ways, I could have said to him, Hernando, well, I already knew that from watching the famous film, The Godfather, this kind of mafia in the US and elsewhere, they would fund what the institutions wouldn't, and then they would enforce it. But it's a very important point that doesn't detract from the point, and it really gets to what's going to solve this better: the market and just having an open market, or to try to regulate. But when you regulate, somehow entry seems to happen any place. I bet you know this guy, since you know everybody else, these other people. William Baumol.
Yes, I know him. Ball-mouse disease.
Exactly.
But it does not work for developing countries. So for example, the tertiary education in Jamaica relative to America is woefully cheap. I think that diversity programs, regulations, and bureaucracy are driving costs in tertiary education in the States.
That's again, what you're saying as well, the context. I mean, I think this is kind of my big, kind of interest for the last couple years, is the specific context. I'm not saying Jamaica, the US. I'm saying Indiana versus California. I'm actually saying central Indiana, which is where Indianapolis is, and the population, the educated population, a lot of the people coming from someplace else. That's a very different context than the south part of the state, which is rural, not so educated. So, it's one thing to say context matters. It's another thing to say, what are the relevant contexts? And that's again why it's so hard to get a formula for sure. But no, I wasn't actually, Baumol has his famous disease, which it's interesting which is more famous. He's also got this famous paper where it's interesting view. He assumes in his model or his thinking that the propensity of people to be entrepreneurs is normally distributed. And he says it's going to be the same every place in the world. The only difference is, do they decide to go into productive entrepreneurship, which is a way of saying quality entrepreneurship, or unproductive entrepreneurship, which is either illegal entrepreneurship, like we were talking about, selling drugs or doing, or criminal activities, even better, probably. I don't think anybody's really in favor of, there's crime and there's crime, right? I mean, smoking marijuana used to be a crime. Now it's not. So even that's kind of complicated. But he was thinking more of the Soviet Union, where, or at least during the old Soviet Union, where pretty much everything was prohibited. So anybody who was an entrepreneur was doing it informally, under the table. So his kind of thinking is the institutions that work in a country, society, are the ones that give incentives for entrepreneurs to go into the so-called productive entrepreneurship. That's a very popular thinking. There's a lot of kind of, I'm proud to say when he was alive, I would very quietly kind of say, well, maybe that, that's not quite exactly right. He would say, of course it's not right. Exactly. It's just a model.
Yes, I'm fond of William, and he also had very interesting perspectives on openness and its relation to entrepreneurship. But earlier you mentioned corruption, and there's a popular paper, it was published by Cambridge, arguing that corruption can impede growth, but even in spite of corruption, growth is likely to occur. And I think that the causal channel is the distinction between what I call procedural corruption and rampant corruption. So for example, if entrepreneurs are corrupt, but the leader is committed to economic reforms and this leader is predictable, then if the corrupt policies also promote economic growth in the sense that the entrepreneur is not just a rent seeker, but he's willing to invest in the country, then the impact of corruption on growth is less deleterious. However, if the corruption is rampant in the sense that a businessman gets a waiver and is not building a business, then corruption becomes a problem. But as long as the environment is predictable, people will produce.
There's at least two things I really like about your insight. Well, three. At least. Hold on, I've got to plug my laptop in before I run out of electricity.
Okay.
I like your insight, but electricity is even more important, right?
Yes.
Thomas Edison was right, I guess. You need electricity. Okay. And one thing I like, the most maybe obvious, is that what you say really seems to explain the world. But the other thing I like is how you use your own kind of framework, I like to say it, your own model in your head. I think, sounds like you kind of dreamt this up, created it, which is political versus economic. And these are two different, you said institutions, but it would also could be institutions that affect corruption, right? And how this is a good way to divide up things. And I think that's a really valuable insight and contribution. As I said, when I hear it, I think, oh yeah, no, you didn't invent that. It's been in my mind, but that's the thing. It's been in my mind. I've never quite divided things up that way. I divide up things in another way, just the way, how the popular press kind of says, oh, red state, blue state. They're dividing things up that way. I don't want to say it's right or wrong, but when I was in economics in graduate school, professor once said, well, the key to all economic thinking is how the thinker, they were talking about the great thinkers like Marx or Adam Smith, how do they divide up into exactly what you're doing, into saying, this is not like this. So for Karl Marx, it was capital and labor. For Keynes, it was, consumption, savings, investment. They're just dividing it up very differently. So the way you're kind of seeing what's important is it political institutions, economic institutions, which then links up to political corruption, economic corruption, and then the types, I think, is a great insight. The other thing I like, the third thing I like about your point is, once again, you're saying, unfortunately, it's tough to generalize. It's going to depend on the context. So when people, in the old economics I learned, it was beautiful. No wonder people, I don't know about making America great again. I want to make economics great again, or the world. It all seems so simple. And
David, let me make a quick point. We're living in the golden age of economics. The problem is that the personalities of mainstream figures are just boring. That's the issue.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right.
Yeah, we don't have David Landes and Milton Friedman anymore. We have people who are always second guessing themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a good insight. I think that is a good insight. But I think that's really good. But there was a sense, including Milton Friedman, that we could generalize these great. I had an argument with a colleague a million years ago, and he says economic laws have to hold no matter the time period, no matter the context. I remember the Berlin Wall was up, and he went over. We're in West Berlin. He went over to East Berlin, and he goes, "You're not going to believe it. People there maximize profits too. You know, profit maximizing is like a universal law." And that sense of universality. On the other hand, you've got what you're kind of thinking about, which is, yeah, but the context matters on either the application, the manifestation, what it's more nuanced, it's more complicated than that. And but I think both can be right for sure, but it gives you a different perspective.
Yeah, so for example, maybe what we need to be doing now is to study the difference between productive rent seeking and unproductive rent seeking. On a net level, rent seeking is productive because the costs may outweigh the benefits, but productive rent seekers are more likely to engage in profitable activities in the sense that they're not just corrupt, they're businessmen who are also corrupt, whereas unproductive rent seekers are just corrupt people.
You know, that I agree with your point. And it sounds like you've read Mansur Olson too, right?
I've read him a bit.
Yeah. Who's your favorite rent-seeking author?
So I like Anne Kruger.
Ah,
Yeah,
yeah,
she's the genius. She's the guru.
yes. I like when I was young, like you once, I was at one of the first conferences I went to, and I presented a paper, something like the deregulation movement in the United States, an anti-rent seeking revolution. And my discussant was this guy Mansur Olson. He won a Nobel Prize for this work, actually, and he was very kind, because basically my paper was on why he was wrong based on this episode of deregulation in the U.S. And he was so kind and generous, but I'm still amazed at my audacity to tell this Nobel Prize winner back there, "You're wrong." But you know, I think that the complication, like all these concepts, and this is what makes our business so interesting. I mean, yes, we understand the concept of rent seeking, but as we get into the practice, almost like crime. I mean, crime is defined by laws, but is something rent seeking behavior, or is it actually productive? And the eye is in the beholder lots of times. Some kind of activity could be classified as rent seeking. But in the end, you know, I find this is true of entrepreneurship too. It's very hard to classify actually what is entrepreneurship, especially if you want the definition. Well, it's got to be quality entrepreneurship, because my claim to fame is, besides having met Mansur Olson and Baumel, and well, I'm old, I also met Ben and Jerry. And when they were just starting out, yeah, they were just starting out in the gas station in Burlington, Vermont. And you know what? They didn't look like they were rent seeking, but they certainly didn't look like they were quality entrepreneurship. These are a couple burned out hippies trying to like get enough money so they could eat. And the ice cream was good. And you know, nobody would have thought that this would turn into quality. I don't mean the ice cream, of course. I mean the growth of the company. Turns out it was an innovation and so on. So I could imagine a lot of my colleagues they're kind of like the Taliban with the long hair and the beards, and oh, no, Ben and Jerry, they're not quality entrepreneurship. Well, now with hindsight, of course, sure, that was quality entrepreneurship. Same thing with rent seeking. I'm trying to think of a good example where something like lobbying seems like it's negative, but it's actually positive. Like, for example, how about this? The lobby efforts that were behind the Bayh-Dole Act. I'm sure there was a lot of lobbying. In fact, one of my mentors was, for a period of time, the president of the American Land Grant and State University National Association in Washington. And he said, yeah, we're basically a lobby group for the universities, but we'd prefer to call ourselves, we're in the education business. We educate Congress people. That's kind of the point. Is it lobbying? Is it rent seeking to try to divert resources? Or is it actually something productive? So in hindsight, we say, oh, all that rent seeking while lobbying for Bayh-Dole, that was one of the greatest investments made for entrepreneurship. I mean, I agree with you.
But remember, we have a
Yeah.
right to free speech, and we also petition the government. So lobbying is just another expression of free speech. It becomes a
Yes.
problem when resources are diverted to suit narrow political agendas. So for example, in your article, you write, we find that entrepreneurs in developing countries are likely to benefit more from the improvement of bankruptcy laws than entrepreneurs in developed countries. So insolvency legislation is important. Remember, Richard Cobden, he was also a lobbyist, but his lobbying resulted in freer policies.
You know, that's, boy, I'm impressed. You really looked at the paper. And, you know, I stand by those results. They sound compelling. They sound believable. But what we really should have written is that based on our measures of bankruptcy legislation, based on our measures of entrepreneurship. And so I want to say, Lipton, to you, well, young man, let me give you a lesson. The distinction between concepts like rent seeking, like even lobbying, or even bankruptcy. Now, bankruptcies are laws. But even then, when they're measured into, like, I forget which database we use, I think the World Bank, you know, they're coming up with one kind of these indicators are measures of a concept, just like any measure of entrepreneurship. So one of the things is, and you were quick to jump on this, a measure for quality entrepreneurship it's a indicator, it's a measure. There's a concept there. First of all, people may not agree totally on the concept, but the measure is always going to kind of fall short, just like measures for human capital. You know, educated people like you and me tend to think, okay, human capital is, you know, educational attainment, years in school, highest degree. Sounds like you've got a lot of all those things, Lipton.
No, I just have a BA, that's all.
Oh, really? Well,
Yes.
It sounds like, by the way, my oldest son is that way too. And if we could talk about what he told me once about that. But and that's kind of the point. Bill Gates, by the way, of course, doesn't have as much human capital as you, right? He dropped out of college. So at least you've got more human capital than Bill Gates. You know what? Nobody's going to believe that. So it shows the measures are just measures of some concept. And I think in the end, we all kind of forget, even when, you know, you read those sentences, we're not qualifying our findings, well, based on our very, not flawed, but limited qualified measures. And in a way, we're kind of inviting young people, future generations, say, improve on the concepts, improve on the measures, and then maybe we'll start to uncover some of these nuances you're raising.
Well, David, maybe you are incorrect. Bill Gates has more human capital. The issue is that we are mistaken in our understanding of human capital. Human capital is distinct from education. So education is getting the degree in engineering. Human capital is starting Google or filing a patent. So Bill Gates created a company, so he has translated education into human capital.
Well,
my human capital is
my only argument, Lipton, is I'm exactly correct. That was my point. I mean, Bill Gates, nobody's going to say Bill Gates doesn't, but based on the measures, because the measures typically, so we typically say, I'll say France is more human capital than Germany. But because we're measuring human capital as highest degree or years in school, France is that. What we don't measure is, how about this famous apprentice system where people get skills? We can't measure the experience, the practical insights that, or whatever, the genius even. So that's exactly my point. No, I don't believe Bill Gates, I don't believe you have more human capital right than Bill Gates, the flaws in the measure. And yet in the research, including ours, we say, oh, human capital has this kind of, what we should say, given these very limited measures of human capital. And so in a way, it challenges thinkers, researchers to say, well, do these insights hold for other contexts, like you say, but also as we improve measures, will we start finding different results? Just like you started off by saying, we may find one thing for entrepreneurship, but we may find something different for quality entrepreneurship, a measure of it, and less quality entrepreneurship. So right there, we're recognizing that the measures we've been using maybe are too homogeneous and need to be broken down. So in a way, we're fighting this battle of trying to gain more knowledge, insight for ourselves, for knowledge for its own sake, but then also to guide policy thinkers, the public debates. We're trying to fight one battle on the conceptual level. So these concepts, we invent new concepts like rent seeking. I want to say, young man, when I was your age, I don't think the concept of rent seeking existed. And of course, somebody invented it. I'm not sure who was the person. Was it Mankeros or somebody else? But it was invented. But all of the concepts, Milton Friedman, before Milton Friedman, he invented a lot of concepts. But then we've got measures of things, and there's always this tension. And then we've got context, which is really what you kind of drove. So one of the things, sure, the developing country context is different than developed country context. But then I say, oh yeah, the Indiana context is different than the Silicon Valley context.
And one of the key takeaways from your article is that at the end, I read the notes, you give examples of countries with high rates of unproductive entrepreneurship. So for example, you measure the link between regulation and entrepreneurship, corruption and entrepreneurship, venture capital funding, and also government programs. So some like Scott Shane, they argue that the government should invest in high value entrepreneurs, the gazelles, because these are the entrepreneurs that are mainly responsible for driving growth. But in your second paper, you know that lifestyle entrepreneurship is also important. It's titled The Future of Entrepreneurship, the Few or the Many. And this is of interest to me because at the end of your first paper, you say the 5 countries with the highest rates of unproductive entrepreneurship are Philippines, Jamaica, Bulgaria, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And I am from Jamaica. And Jamaica has been investing in entrepreneurship for a long time, but the programs are not gaining fruit. And I attribute it to the high level of necessity-driven entrepreneurship.
Wow, I'm really impressed by your focus and knowledge of these specific papers, but also more general, just ideas and the literature. And I would say, first of all, I could say, well, ideas and people evolve. I'm sure you've heard of this. I do know, whether you've read them or not, Joseph Schumpeter, right?
Yes, I am a fan of Joseph Schumpeter. And
yeah, but of course,
his thesis was recently confirmed again by someone at Cato.
Yeah, but there's many Schumpeters. People call a Schumpeter one. So in the 1911 Schumpeter, he seemed to really believe in this idea of entrepreneurship. People starting businesses drive the creative destruction, drives innovation. By 1942, when he writes Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, he seems to have shifted, and it looks to the large established companies. And this has all been a lot, schizophrenic Schumpeter, 2 Schumpeters. And all I can say is, yeah, that's somebody evolving in their own thinking in an evolving world. But I would say, so one answer is, sure, my own thoughts, and they have evolved and changed over time. It's not like, these are not like, even who knows, maybe the law of physics is going to change at some point. We've seen things like that, so-called laws. But I will say this, part of this is the motivation why I keep getting up in the morning and doing this and enjoy talking to you. It's to reconcile contradictions is part of the challenge. And part of that challenge is, remember, we've got certain measures, and these are empirical papers. So in the, in the first paper you talk about, we've got these measures, and based on these measures, and based on our measure of quality entrepreneurship, what that is, and then less quality entrepreneurship, and then based on our measures of institutions and corruption, that you just repeated the findings. Now, why do we come out with a different paper, not that long after me and Don Caracco in The Few of the Many? Because I think in the end, we're challenging what I was saying or classifying as quality entrepreneurship in the first paper, which is a measure. I mean, it's a concept that when we measure it, because it may be that the quality, so we argue, comes from the many for all kinds of reasons. And I think that context matters for sure. This is one of the things, and this is a big theme in the entrepreneurship literature. The kind of entrepreneurship it seems to be important, probably depends on the place. And I think what we're pushing against in that paper is the idea that every place, Indiana, Nebraska, Jamaica, it doesn't matter where, needs the Silicon Valley kind of entrepreneurship, where we can see from other evidence and every other theory that actually having a lot of small businesses, self-employed people, startups, that can be very positive. Now, in a way, we're talking more to the field and saying this can be entrepreneurship, not to mention the very troubling problem I shared with you before, which is when I went to visit Ben and Jerry. Well, first of all, there's a lot of calories in their ice cream. That's the biggest problem. But secondly, nobody would have qualified or classified them as quality entrepreneurship. Same thing, by the way, with Amazon when it was started. All the smart people I'd read about in the Wall Street Journal, again, they'd be like the Taliban. Oh, no. There's no business plan. There's no, well, look at them now, right? And so, this is always my kind of quibble with people who say the government ought to. It's like, you know what, young man, I would say to Lipton, you should only invest in companies that are going to go be successful. Well, nobody can do that, right? We know it's all about risk, uncertainty, and entrepreneurship is inherently uncertain. So, I'm throwing a lot of things out there, but it's true. I can say both things at the same time. But if you think about it more mundane, Lipton, is getting a vaccination, I mean, is it good for you or bad for you? This seems to be tearing the world apart. I'll tell you this, it's bad for some people, right? If they've got an allergy, I mean, if they're allergic to it, it can kill them, right? For children under some age, they're not sure. It's going to depend on the context again. I mean, they can say in general, it's one thing, but if they were sure it were good for people with the allergy, well, they, no, it could, I said it could kill them, or young children, they're unsure. And so it's context specific. Even so, this is what a lot of the debate seems to be about, is that you can't promise us this is good for everybody, but there does clearly seem to be a tendency, right? The scientists say.
Yeah, the COVID, in the era of COVID, the best buffer against the disease is an improved diet. Because yes, some after vaccination, some people are still able to transmit the virus and some may contract it again. But a diet may buffers against the negative effects of the virus in the event that we contract it.
Well, like many things, diet. So once again, I can see your thinking, which, you may be a lowly, in my world, the hierarchy of things, at least you're above Bill Gates. You may be a lowly bachelor's degree student, but at least you're above Bill Gates. But the way you think is really like a first-rate researcher, scholar, which is to look for the more deeper causality. And the fun of that is the hypotheses or the theories are relatively easy to come up with, like what you said. The empirical proof, just like say with the COVID, takes painstaking test after test after test. In a way, now I'm back to one of your basic insights is context matters. So what may hold for one person may not hold for another. The way diet, I mean, so in a way, the empirical evidence is always lagging behind. And so a lot of these issues, like about corruption, institutions, entrepreneurship, quality, so-called quality, less quality entrepreneurship. I mean, I feel, I want to accuse you of being a young person. There's worse things in the world than that, I can tell you.
Yeah, but
But I want to say, I can feel your impatience, which is, let's do a study. No, we're not going to know something until there have been lots and lots and lots and lots of studies and lots of context. And then somehow I'm not sure who we is, start to get more confidence of, like the law of supply and demand. It holds mostly, but if you remember inferior goods and Griffin goods and so on, Giffen goods, there's some exceptions. So again, it depends on the context.
But what I like about your paper on the future of entrepreneurship is that the implicit message in your article is this: performance-driven entrepreneurship matters. So for example, Harvard did a study, well, not Harvard, but Harvard Business Review reported on a study some years ago saying that high growth entrepreneurs are concentrated in the retail sector, but we often invest in tech firms. Any sector can produce the next Amazon and Google. Therefore, governments are less likely to take risks because they're banking on our money. So governments, if they must invest in entrepreneurs, should finance performance-driven entrepreneurs, business with the potential to grow, or businesses that have demonstrated their potential to grow.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Well, there is another issue about potential to grow that I'll get into about the many, but now I'm back to, but the problem is, and you said it, so which of entrepreneur is likely to have the potential to grow? If you look at, say, the National Football League, they vet the college graduates incredibly, millions of dollars trying to figure out who's going to be the best player. And sometimes they get it right and sometimes they don't. Same things with the entrepreneurs, and so when you say, well, the examples are not always high tech. Sure. You ever hear Walmart? I mean,
yeah,
Walmart. Yeah. And you've heard of Ben and Jerry's. I mean, I remember Ben and Jerry. They were anything. Actually, one was at the handheld ice cream machine. The other was at the cash register. This did not look high tech. Now, some people may say, yeah, well, Ben and Jerry and their kind of outsourcing model was you can always tell a story, but a priori, it just seemed like, or it's probably Starbucks. Starbucks seemed like another coffee shop, right? So that's your point. It's hard to know. And speaking of the Small Business Innovation Research Program, years ago, I was part of a study put together by the National Academy of Sciences to analyze its impact. And we found out it's generally very positive. They target high growth, innovative, quality firms, like that advice suggests. And so we were presenting this to Congress, and the head of the study, a guy named Charles Wessner, is presenting this before Congress, the results. And I'm thinking, I'm really proud to be part of the team, and it's great to be up on the Hill, Capitol Hill. And this old ancient congresswoman from California, I can't remember her name, she points her bony finger at Chuck, our leader, Charles Wessner, and says, tell me, sir, how can the US government pick winners better than losers? And there's a hush, there's a gasp in the audience, because everybody knows, right, Lipton, government can't pick winners. And but Chuck gets up, and I thought, oh, he's finished. The project's finished. He doesn't miss a beat. He gets up and he says, madam, he goes, we don't pick winners, we pick losers. Then there's even a bigger gasp in the audience. But of course, what Chuck meant, and he explained, well, most of the companies getting SBR grants don't succeed, they fail. But somehow the overall impact on society, on the economy, is beneficial. So, we get down to, it's very hard. It's easy to say, oh, policy should should select either winners or, high performing firms. But there's so many examples. And of course, this is what the venture capitalists or any investors are trying to do. And we know they take a portfolio approach because it's impossible to, as we'd say in baseball, bat 100% or 1,000 all the time, right?
Yeah, so we're wrapping up, David, but do you know what
Yes.
Western countries like America and Switzerland have over developing countries like Jamaica and Bangladesh? Cognition styles. They're different in cognition. So for example, Westerners are individualistic. Individualism is a predictor of innovation and entrepreneurship, and Americans are especially individualistic. Westerners also score higher on measures of intellectual autonomy, whereas some places in the developing world, they suffer from a scarcity mindset. Affluent countries have an affluent mindset because they're already rich. Therefore, they have confidence in their potential to grow, and their mindset is global. So recently I was speaking to a relative and she was saying that in Jamaica, YouTubers are complaining because they have many viewers. American YouTubers have less viewers, but the American YouTubers get more money. And I said to her, Jamaica is a speck on the dot. If they want to make it on YouTube, they must target the world, and two, they need to invest in business and intellectual acumen. Jamaicans have a comparative advantage in entertainment, but they have been unable to translate that advantage into a competitive advantage because they lack business and intellectual acumen.
Boy, this is our final insight, but the way you think analytically, kind of going for the root core of the problem. I mean, you may be right, you may be wrong with your kind of model framework, but it's great. And I will say that leads, which will end. Maybe we'll have another conversation. That's why I think what I like to think I created this phrase. You may have created the dichotomy between political economic institutions, but the strategic management of places really makes all the difference. What does that mean? You take what's there, the resources, the culture, the thinking, and then you figure out, as you said, here's a place that's got a strength for entertainment. Well, so does Hollywood. Hollywood seemed to go global. Why not Jamaica? But we can see other places that have too, India, all kinds of places. So that says, what can the strategy be given some things, it's almost like that old cliche, right, Lipton, old to me at least, that says, change what's changeable for the better and accept those things that you can't change. That's almost like the long and the short run. But thank you very much. I really appreciate
it's
this
a pleasure to
conversation
speak
with
to you.
with a bright, brilliant young mind like yours is why I'm in the business. Thanks very much.
Yes. All right, then. Bye.
Talk again sometime. Bye-bye.
Yeah. All right. Bye.